Hello and welcome everyone, and thanks for listening in with us today. I'm Erica Villarreal Ekwurzel, founder of CivicAIM, a philanthropy advisory practice working with individuals, families, and teams within organizations, aiming to strengthen their grant-making, governance, and impact. I'm thrilled to be here today for this episode of Redefining Philanthropy in Practice and Profession. I recently launched this new CivicAIM video series that features leaders who are at the forefront of centering equity in philanthropy. In each episode, you will meet some of the most courageous, resourceful practitioners of color, leaders who go beyond a business as usual mindset and show us what philanthropy can be if it's structured to drive justice across communities and generations. My hope is that Redefining Philanthropy in this series serves as a forum that sparks ideas and inspires action, moving us all closer to a philanthropy that is truly equitable. Today, I'm honored to have my colleague and someone I respect highly, Dr. David Maurrasse, joining me in conversation. A quick bit of background. David is an author, a speaker, and an institutional change expert. He is founder and president of Marga, Inc., a consulting firm founded in 2000, providing strategic advice and research to philanthropic initiatives and community partnerships. And he's been a longtime leader and facilitator of the Race and Equity in Philanthropy group, which engages foundations in peer learning and change in their institutional policies and practices. I first met David through our work together with the National Network of Consultants to Grantmakers. David leads the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force. And I'm really excited just to dive in to learn more about David and his personal and professional journey in philanthropy. You've been working on redefining philanthropy for 2 decades, working with large traditional institutions to make change inside out that lead them to become more equitable, inclusive organizations. I'm curious as to your why you do what you do. Why is this work important to you and personal for you? And what was the path that led you to launch Marga, Inc. and the Racial and Equity in Philanthropy group?
Well, thanks for that. There's a lot there as far as that question is concerned. I think for me, it's more, you mentioned the personal side. I think it's more of a personal mission for me. I think for me, in terms of developing a career and in terms of developing the ways I want to contribute in my life, everything really has to be aligned along kind of a personal mission. So for me, it was never about one single institution or even necessarily one single industry. It really was always about a personal mission. And my personal mission has really always focused on how to creatively leverage existing resources for the purposes of community change, of equity, and justice. And I found philanthropy as, of course, an intriguing way to go about doing that. And, I've been curious about the field really from the very beginning. When I started working in the nonprofit sector, I first started working on the fundraising side, actually, of the nonprofit sector. I worked at a public interest law firm as an associate director of development. And that's how I started to get exposed to philanthropy. And of course, I saw its promise and I also saw its many contradictions and just wanted to figure out a way to contribute in some capacity. And I really wasn't sure exactly where that would ultimately lead me. I ended up working at the Rockefeller Foundation in the late 1990s on a portfolio called Building Community. It was a great opportunity because I learned so much more about philanthropy than I ever would have imagined because I had been on the outside of it and then ended up spending time on the inside of it. But for me also, in addition to trying to have a personal mission in terms of the nature of the work that I do professionally, it's also important for me to try to figure out what are the best fits for me in terms of the kinds of contributions that I ultimately want to make and the type of work that I want to do. And ultimately, after having spent time at a place like the Rockefeller Foundation. And I also have a background as an academic, and having spent time at different universities as a faculty member, I realized that probably the best way for me to contribute was in a more independent setting, which ultimately led to the creation of Marga Incorporated. And Marga Incorporated, as you mentioned, is a consulting firm, and it's something that I started in 2000, which was at the time I was leaving the Rockefeller Foundation and entering a second full-time academic position at Columbia University. So for me, it was a matter of trying to create a consulting firm while still having full-time employment, but ultimately transitioning out to making the consulting firm really an independent entity on its own. Some of the early work of Marga Incorporated was really about research initiatives that would lead to the development of new projects that would last for some time. And you mentioned the Race and Equity in Philanthropy group, which is something that Marga Incorporated has been coordinating since 2006. And what led to the creation of this initiative was a study that was commissioned by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So during the time I was at Rockefeller, I met a number of people at different foundations, which is another part of the beauty of working in a single foundation. I met people who were working on similar things. We had similar grantees in common who were at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And I was contacted by a group within Annie E. Casey back in 2002, which was called Respect. And it was an internal group, an internal dialogue among staff members at all levels of the foundation on various matters related to race, to racial equity, to racial justice, to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this group wanted to commission a study of how other foundations were addressing these issues in their practices, in whatever way that would ultimately look like, and essentially asked me to do that. And that study did exactly what it was intended to do. It brought back these ideas to the Annie E. Casey Foundation, but what it also did was raise questions among some of the foundations who were interviewed, who said that they also wanted similar kinds of results. And so as a result of those conversations, we ultimately started coordinating a series of focus groups among some of those foundations. And then those foundations said they wanted to have a permanent table in which they would periodically come together and share ideas and lessons, really with the intent of helping to strengthen and inform their respective ability to transform their particular foundations. And this group has ultimately lasted over quite some period of time and has actually seen some real changes in philanthropy over the course of that period.
Yeah. No, thank you, David. That's amazing. I know when I first learned about you and your work, I was just really amazed as you serving as a lead facilitator to these conversations that typically happen internally within institutions, let alone in a peer setting, that then, as you shared, a study and white papers are developed and distributed to help kind of socialize this within the philanthropic field. And so for our listeners, I do want to share that there are a handful of white papers that I will be sharing in addition to this recording that Marga Inc. has taken and kind of and captured some of the key findings and learnings from these peer networks. So definitely want to draw attention to that. And then a second comment that really comes up, as you mentioned, you have quite a pedigree in philanthropy, in working on the front lines, as well as, as a development officer, in addition to working for one of the highly revered institutional grant makers, the Rockefeller Foundation, in addition to being an academic researcher and professor. And so along this way, what I think is particularly interesting is that you found that that for your yourself, your leadership, your curiosity in kind of pushing a profession forward was most effective in the work that you do now as an independent consultant. And I find that, again, I want to share this because there's a variety of different ways that people can and roles that people can either step into or make their own, which you have done with Marga Inc., which enables you to be much more nimble, agile, as well as help lead or co-lead conversations and practices. So thank you for just kind of sharing that. And those were some threads that I really wanted to acknowledge, because we don't always see that, particularly as a BIPOC leader who is stepping in a space that may not identify with who we are and still be emboldened to do that. So I want to move on. So in this, again, through the variety of roles, what's the arc of change that you've seen in the field over the last 15, 20 years? And so I want that long-term vision, but I also want what's happened in these last like 2.5 years about the momentum towards racial equity and justice. And do you see this as a sustained trend that will last, and what your thoughts are?
Thanks for that. Well, certainly going back to the Race and Equity and Philanthropy group and the thread there, and just thinking about how that group has evolved over the years. When that study was conducted by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and one of the findings that really stood out from that was the fact that very few foundations had actual policies and practices that were directly about race or racial equity. What they might have had was a grant-making portfolio, not necessarily a grant-making strategy with a racial equity lens, but maybe a single portfolio. So what was happening was that the level of commitment in foundations was so limited, and it really wasn't necessarily touching the rest of the foundation. So many programs within foundations were not addressing issues related to race, racial equity, or DEI. And then you had these single programs where it was all being placed. And of course, you run the risk of real marginalization. And then, of course, there's the whole rest of the foundation in terms of the policies, the practices. How does the foundation operate? How does it make decisions? Who does it hire? How does it hire? How does it procure? How does it invest? All of these other aspects of the foundation. And of course, when you mentioned something like investment and knowing that foundations are required to pay out 5%, you always have to ask that question, what about the other 95%? So there were lots of questions back 20 years ago that really weren't being asked as frequently as they are now. And certainly with the Race and Equity and Philanthropy group, we were in a position where we were a smaller group. Our core membership was about 6, 7 members. Now it's closer to double that amount. And then we now see some real increased levels of interest among foundations as well as among philanthropy serving organizations. So one of the things we've been doing through the Race and Equity and Philanthropy group has been working with various philanthropy serving organizations to organize similar kinds of learning exchanges among some of their members. So what's happening is that there's this increased level of interest. And certainly I think there has been more movement in some foundations in terms of their policies and practices. On the one hand, we're encouraged by the racial reckoning of the last few years, But on the other hand, you can see that there is clearly a growing reaction to, or a backlash to, that racial reckoning in various parts of the country. And what does that mean for foundations, and how foundations do work that does it ultimately challenge some of the things that are going on, and voter suppression, opposition to so-called critical race theory? Are there direct responses to that in philanthropy? Is philanthropy going to stand strong as some of that level of opposition gains steam? So there's a lot to really consider in this regard.
No, you're right. And I, as an optimist, both and who I am, but also as a professional and an academic researcher myself, I do feel that there is a change occurring and evolving within our field. And I think there are a variety of aspects, that occur to that, where, philanthropy is no longer practiced as it had been in earlier generations. We have up and coming millennials who are thinking differently and globally, yet still acting locally. We also have if there is anything good that has occurred within these 2.5 years, it is this amplification of kind of shining the light, talking about accountability, and as you mentioned, that transformation. And so even though the outcome is yet still to be determined, I find that conversations like what we're having today, the work that we do when we get offline is crucial and important, and everybody has a role to helping just create accountability with our field.
Well, one other thing I'd like to add, in just thinking about this arc of change and the evolution of philanthropy over the last few years. So while on the one hand we have some foundations that are coming new to this conversation, particularly in the last, say, 3 years. On the other hand, we do have a level of conversation in philanthropy that is really pushing on the very notion of philanthropy in itself and its origins, and the need to decolonize, and the need to really challenge power and power dynamics. And I can say that's even the case in the Race and Equity and Philanthropy group, whereas over the years, we have focused mostly on changing particular systems, policies, practices around organizational culture, how data is collected, evaluation and learning, communications, really focusing on the specific systemic aspects of foundations. Now our conversation is increasingly about power and power sharing. And what does power sharing look like in philanthropy? But power sharing has lots of different dimensions, whether it's participatory grant making, whether it's the kinds of conversations that have taken place in the last couple of years because of the racial reckoning, but also because of the pandemic, about finding ways to have more of a partnership between foundations and grantees, about foundations really easing up on restrictions and reporting around really all of those dimensions that come into play there as in the trust-based philanthropy. So all of those kinds of conversations are underway. And so there are many manifestations of it. And I think it's important to understand what those manifestations are and really counsel foundations in a way that helps them see the range of possibilities and to take them on a journey that really makes the most sense for them. It's a balancing act, but it's a balancing act that I think is important for us to pursue.
What would you say to professionals of color looking to get started in philanthropy and to intentionally create a space in a field that works for them?
Well, philanthropy is a very relational field. I don't think that has entirely changed. It is a field in which relationships open doors, and that's how I ultimately landed at the Rockefeller Foundation, because there was a person who knew that I would be interested if asked. And that person told someone at the foundation, and that person at the foundation contacted me. And that is how a lot of things happen in philanthropy, very relational. So when you're talking about institutional foundations like the Rockefeller that have really taken on a life of their own as large private foundations, they sort of transcend the family, so to speak. That's one path in to philanthropy. When you look at family foundations, where it really is about people who already have wealth as individuals, and they're the ones who are really running the foundations, you can see how the relationships can play a real role in terms of who ends up becoming consultants to family foundations and to wealthy individuals. And so how do we find ways to create more pathways for people of color, for BIPOC folks to enter philanthropy, I think is really important. But in terms of what you could do to be proactive, if you're a person who wants to enter philanthropy and figure out a way, maybe you've been on the other side in the nonprofit sector and want to figure out a way to get into philanthropy. For me, one of the things that was important, of course, this was many years ago, it was conversations, and it was informational interviews with people who were at different foundations, and then one person leading me to another, leading me to another, leading me to another. You don't really know when that opportunity might arise. And of course, as I mentioned, in terms of the story of how I got to the Rockefeller Foundation, was, ultimately something that I didn't even know was going on until somebody contacted me. So that's one part of it. And I hope at NNCG, we can help to forge more pathways for people of color to become philanthropy consultants.
So now as we round out our time, I've got one last question, David. Knowing that philanthropy is just one part of a larger ecosystem that is necessary for wide-scale systemic change, what are your hopes for what is possible when it comes to redefining philanthropy?
Thanks for that question. Marga Incorporated's work really it's about philanthropy, but it is also about that ecosystem in a lot of ways, particularly some of the work that we do in local communities, which really are about helping to catalyze foundations' ability to facilitate change in their local communities. And actually, excuse me, I'm heading tomorrow to our client in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is called the Foundation for a Healthy St. Petersburg. And one of the things we're doing with them is helping to create something that's called the St. Petersburg Anchor Institutions Initiative. And what it is a way to, in some way, leverage the resources of local employers, particularly hospitals, as well as the local government, to bring about greater racial equity in that city, really focusing on a historically Black community and trying to bring different forms of capital through, whether it's through jobs or through employment contracts, to that particular community, and doing it with a racial equity lens. So there are ways in which foundations can play a really catalytic role. One of the benefits of philanthropy is the ability to convene. And at the local level, a number of different foundations have the opportunity to really bring a range of different types of institutions to the table. And so there are real creative and interesting ways in which foundations can be transformative in their local communities, within themselves as institutions. I think whenever we look at this work, we have to talk about being mutually transformative. We can't have foundations that simply say, I want to send more grants to BIPOC communities and not self-reflect on themselves in terms of what is their own level of commitment to racial equity, how do they operate as an institution. It's not just about sending out grant dollars, it's also about looking at and reflecting on your practice. One of the encouraging things is that it seems like many more foundations are open to dialogue about some of these kinds of issues. But as we discussed earlier on, we don't really know. We don't really know for sure how long this level of interest will last. So for those of us who are consultants, who are trying to contribute to this field in some way, how do we do things that can last? How do we do things that can reach larger groups of people? You mentioned the factor earlier on that the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group has created various papers. One of the things that we had to confront in this group, sort of in the middle of its life as it was evolving, was the fact that there's a lot of value for the foundations who are around the table, and there's a lot of learning that's coming from that. But how do we bring that learning to larger audiences within philanthropy? We know that it was important for us to focus on the foundations themselves and transforming themselves and educating themselves, mutually reinforcing their various work, because we know we can't see real change in philanthropy until we see real change in foundations and in philanthropists. So a field-wide conversation is one thing, but we have to see institutional change within the foundations. So for us, we were challenged with the question of how do we influence institutional change in foundations beyond this core group? And so one of our conclusions was to create these papers. So the last one we did was on communications. So we chose communications, internal and external, as a topic for a series of meetings. And then we created a paper based on the experiences of the foundations in the group, and then disseminated that paper. And then the other thing that we've been doing, which I had mentioned before, is working with different philanthropy serving organizations and working with clusters of their members in terms of setting up these learning exchanges with clusters of their members with the intent of helping to seed the development of many ongoing learning exchanges among foundations really all over the country. And we developed a very good partnership with the United Philanthropy Forum, which has been a client of Marga Inc. over the years, to identify different philanthropy organizations to work with in this regard. So we're now working with 4 different philanthropy organizations, philanthropy serving organizations, and a cluster of about 8 of their members on this, and we'll continue to do this year after year, and possibly expand that if we can expand the capacity to do it.
Thank you, David. This has been just an amazing conversation. You lead an amazing, firm that, again, is helping both capture and build our field. Also, I see you as a mentor of mine. I get to, the ability to be able to work and serve alongside you that will help shape and just diversify our what philanthropy is and redefining. That really excites me. And I just want to thank you so much, David, for joining me and sharing your expertise and just personal wisdom. And also, more importantly, for those that are listening, just your story, in addition to some of the works that they might be able to apply to their practice and planning and philanthropy. My hope is that Redefining Philanthropy and this series is a forum that sparks ideas and inspires action. As David and I were talking, there's a lot of conversation, but what's that tipping point? What's that kind of lever of change? And what is your role to ensure that we are that as philanthropy, change agents, creating equity. So today you've given us an opportunity to see the person behind the practice and also the pathways forward for practitioners in philanthropy, David. Thank you again, and thank you everyone for being a part of this series, Redefining Philanthropy.